And President Trump has been accused of denying the organization financial aid in order to prevent people from voting.
Organizations, both left and right, that are allegedly there to monitor the electoral process. In many ways, they're actually intimidating voters who want to physically attend those locations as well.
Then see separate armed groups going there and facing off with each other, and the potential for an escalation at those polling stations.
It's what impact does a split office between individuals who support BLM, individuals who can't be bothered because they like the status quo, and individuals who are against what the movement's done or what Antifa is doing. What impact can that have within a business?
I think if it's a Trump win, what we're going to see is an increase in action and violence up to the inauguration day, seeing potentially rioting and looting. And we can't rule out a high-profile terrorist attack, some sort of person on the lunatic fringe of the left actually going out and trying to actually conduct some sort of terrorism incident. So straight off the bat, what do we think? Is there going to be another civil war in the US? I think there's clearly a civil war of opinion and direction of where the US is going towards, which I think is, it's clearly very polarizing at the moment. Can that then slip into violent action being conducted on the ground? Well, yes, we're already seeing that, but on a low level amongst different groups. So factions are growing. They are sort of taking sides. I think for the traditional civil war that we would expect, you'd have to see a complete degradation of police. But what is worrying is that left groups are now trying to do that. They're trying to kind of remove police forces. But for the US, it has the largest military, most well-funded military in the world. So I think we're never going to realistically get to a point where you're going to have a civil war like America experienced previously, but I do think there is the potential for isolated clashes between armed groups. The perfect example being the sort of militia groups and the Not Fucking Around coalition sort of facing off with each other. Lots and lots of armed, angry people facing off with each other. Yeah, exactly, and that's sort of escalating.
Yeah, I mean, never say never, but even with everything going on at the moment, it would still take a lot for a civil war to kick off. So, I mean, even with the opinion polls you mentioned there, it's possible, but there would still have to be a lot that would need to happen for even just to get to the stage where you're at the point of no return.
I think one interesting trend that we witnessed over the course of 2020, and especially coinciding with the violence over the summer, is the exodus from urban cities such as New York and Portland and Seattle, of business people and also people potentially with more Republican or moderate views, who are moving to Republican states or moving to rural areas. So what we may see, and this may be a longer term trend which may have implications in the next decade, but an increasing segregation or polarization of people with opinions moving to geographical areas. So we'll see people moving out of Democratic states into Republican states and vice versa, which then ultimately in the future may increase the lobbying for state segregation or the breakup of the Union.
So secession.
Secession, yeah.
Yeah. And I think that trend at the moment is sort of the beginning of the sort of a push towards the point of no return, but that's still, Harry, as you mentioned, a long way off. A lot of contextual reporting of anecdotal reporting have been looking at. People have been pointing out how a lot of people are already moving from states like New York and California and are moving to Florida and Texas, for example. And amongst a lot of people in Florida and Texas, they're happy for people to move to their state, but what they appear to be, I suppose, the line in the sand for a lot of people who already live in the places like Florida and Texas is, if you're going to leave a state like New York or California, don't bring the sort of line of thinking that created the conditions that you're seeing in New York and California with you. Leave that back in New York and California. So that's possibly where you could start to see the point of no return, is if I suppose a lot of people move from Democrat-run states to Republican-run states and try to have Democrats take over those areas. That's where you could possibly see the indications of a civil war begin. But even then, it would still take a long time.
I think it's also important to be clear that there's a variety of reasons why people move out of certain cities and go to different states. And I think one of the first things we said initially on this podcast when we're talking about politics is the economy is key. And I think a number of businesses move out maybe of California, and maybe not so because of an ideology from the social perspective, but rather because of taxes and things of that nature, to a more business-friendly state like Texas, where a number of tech companies have moved to Dallas, to Austin. And I think it's not only because of high taxes, but I think a split up of operations based on high cost of living, which the Silicon Valley has caused, where employees have a hard time actually being able to buy a house, rent a house, just because of the high cost of living. And I think splitting their operations across the U.S. to more business-friendly or to cheaper states allows kind of a spreading out of the wealth and makes it cheaper probably for them in terms of overhead costs. And I think COVID-19 will also have a significant impact nowadays due to the nature of the pandemic and how people have been forced to work at home. I think a number of companies will likely see that we can probably cut our overhead costs because people are able to do the same job from their home with Zoom, with Skype, with things like that. So I think there might be a change from that type of business perspective. So I think it's important to kind of distinguish that there are some people are moving out of the cities because of unrest, but others are also doing it from purely an individual or business decision.
But generally, that individual or business decision is driven by finances, which in the majority of high tax states are democratic owned. So those people, even though they may not be moving from a personal security perspective, they're still moving and are motivated on some form of ideological grounds to move out of that state and into a low tax Republican state. So they may be moderates, they even maybe have democratic sympathies themselves, but their business model it cannot operate in those environments, so they're moving out. So again, in the long term, this will just increasingly polarize the electorate maybe and allow red and blue states to be increasingly, centered in those areas. So I think as well, one trend we might see with working from home and the economy is the rural and urban divide, and also with the economy getting increasingly worse in the moment with COVID and the lockdowns and the ramifications of that, is the wealth disparity. And as people become poorer in the US, they generally look to more social welfare type policies, and so you may get an increasing number of people in urban areas who have been out of work looking to Democrats or looking to leftist ideology and becoming increasingly radicalized maybe in the future, as well as more affluent people who've left the cities and moved to rural areas, tending to have more right-wing or nationalist ideology or viewpoint. So there could be that split between the urban and rural areas as well.
The worrying part is the path towards extremism is accelerated through economic issues. And, we've always said this in our analysis on looking at places like Europe, that if there's a significant economic impact, it's going to increase extremism. What we didn't expect was COVID-19, a global pandemic that would have such a massive impact on the economy that it's accelerating the path of extremism globally. So that is going to feed into this whole question of a civil war. But I think we're kind of generally in agreement that, yes, there is a civil war in terms of ideology and the path that US should go on. There may be cases of isolated instances of violence flaring, but nothing like what you would imagine the word civil war to actually mean and to be defined as. So moving on then, continuing on the step 2 of define the environment's effect. So what we've done is we've actually looked at the US from a population density perspective, and you kind of see the majority of population within the US is either focused on either of the different coasts. But what we did was we actually overlaid the George Floyd fallout theme from the Intelligence Fusion platform, as well as the left-wing extremism theme from the intelligence fusion platform, and we've kind of came up with 14 locations which have seen the majority of activity. We haven't really factored the right in because the right are more issue based rather than location based, so they will actually attend locations where the left are, and the left are actually conducting activities and try to antagonize them or do counter protests. So the 14 locations that we've come up with are Seattle and Portland, as well as San Francisco, Los Angeles, Denver, Minneapolis, Chicago, Detroit, Louisville, Atlanta, Richmond, Philadelphia, New York, and Washington, D.C., being the political heart of the US. So what we've also pulled together, which you can see on your screen now, is a doctrinal template of both Antifa, and then we're also going to show one regarding Proud Boys. Now, what doctrinal templates allow us to do from an intelligence perspective is, if we know that there's going to be a protest at a key location, we can see historically what the actions are prior to the event, what they do during the event, and kind of what sort of instance they are part of. So kind of just breaking this down. So top left, generally from an Antifa perspective, they will start events of theirs that they start and they attend will begin about 8 p.m. and probably go on to about 2 to 3 a.m. So actions prior to the event, you're looking at things like intelligence of targets and adversaries. They'll do training, they'll do weapons training, they'll do martial arts training. Also planning is conducted on encrypted messaging sites like Telegram, and you also mentioned Signal as well, Matt. Weapons and equipment prepared, so they come with things like slingshots, they come with Molotov cocktails, and even cases of where caches have been set of items ready to be used as part of that event. From a cyber perspective, we've seen things like doxing of targets, so we've seen police officers actually had their details released of their home locations. Hacking, intelligence operations, even part of Antifa's method is to attempt to sort of ridicule people who oppose them. They make out and say, Antifa is just an idea, we're not an organization. But that is all part of their sort of information operations, their psychological operations campaign.
It's almost like gaslighting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And from an asymmetric perspective, we see attempts to get opposition members fired from their jobs, as well as things like hoax bomb threats have been used. On the actual day of the event itself, so we mentioned Antifa forming up points, so it's probably, based on historical precedent, it's about half a mile away from where the actual target location is. And you mentioned this before, Matt, it's normally things like parks which are used as forming up points, where they'll get their equipment ready, they'll get dressed in black bloc, and we've seen videos of vans arriving with pre-prepared banners as well as shields. So clearly there's a logistical element which supports the protesters on the ground. And there has to be somebody from an operational perspective that is actually monitoring this event and actually guiding it and ensuring that everything kind of works in synchronicity. And once you actually get to the target location, the types of incidents that we've witnessed are things like protests, obstruction. So we saw obstruction at events back in sort of 2016 of certain conservative figures who were sort of doing talks, Milo Yiannopoulos, along with Ben Shapiro, these types of people. Which again, kind of feeding in the polarization is, if you don't allow an opposition group to have their free speech, then it just makes them more extreme, because what do they then have? But from an Antifa's perspective, they look at it as if to say, we shouldn't allow fascists to speak anywhere, even if they see that fascists as being a Jew like Ben Shapiro in that instance. As well as riots, looting, vandalism, harassment, intimidation, fireworks and mortars, projectiles thrown, bombings, ABH, GBH, all the way through to arson and murder, which is what we've seen.
Even the use of, they've even been successful in using lasers, laser pointers against police officers. I believe there's been up to I think there's been just over 10. I can't remember if they're actual Portland police officers or federal agents that were guarding the courthouse, but there's quite a few who have actually significant eye damage from the use of Antifa members actually shining laser lights, laser pointers in their eyes, which, one of those, I've had eye surgery a long time ago. That's the power of those things is certainly no joke. Mm-hmm. The right power laser in someone's eyes can blind them permanently.
Yeah. And
that's without firing a single shot.
Yep.
And you can do so at range.
So looking at sort of actions at the target location, we see things like situational awareness being conducted by members who are reporting on security force movements via Telegram, as well as using umbrellas. Umbrellas are a key part of these protests, where you almost have one group who actually go out there and commit acts of violence or vandalism, and then you've got another group who actually support them with umbrellas, who use them to actually block cameras. So I think there was an instance in Portland where they were trying to set fire to one of the federal buildings, and you've got a person who's breaking a window or trying to throw a Molotov cocktail inside, while another person's kind of holding the umbrella up to the CCTV camera to prevent that being actually
not just blocking cameras, but they're also using the umbrellas to mask provocative actions. So they're advancing towards the police. There'll be a perpetrator within the group who will throw a Molotov cocktail or whatever device, and he'll be covered with umbrellas so they can't be seen. And it's a tactic that we've seen spread globally to not just
Hong Kong
to Belarus, other areas where protest groups are using umbrellas now.
Also at the target location, there is an intentional escalation to riot, as well as the targeting of security personnel. We've seen the riots leading to vandalism and looting, as well as attempts to break into buildings to set them on fire, and a move onto residential areas to intimidate and harass residents. And we've got that on the Doctrinal template there, sort of up to a 0.3 miles or a half a kilometre away, and moving to these sort of residential areas, as well as the attempts to set up an autonomous zone. And in terms of actual targets, it's been things like US ICE facilities, local government buildings, capitalist-type businesses such as Starbucks, Amazon, as well as right-wing events and talks, police locations and federal buildings. In terms of the actual quantities of people who will attend, I think it's sort of up to about 1,000 people plus. So for us, from an intelligence perspective, and looking at the US elections, this allows us to actually look at this and say, right, we kind of know doctrinally how they're actually going to operate on the ground. Looking at the Proud Boys as just an example, a lot less actions in relation to them. In terms of the timings, it's sort of starting during the daytime and then ending early evening. There's not really much in terms of night protests or night events that they conduct. Actions prior to the event, you're looking at things like intelligence of targets and adversaries. Planning is conducted again on encrypted messaging sites like Telegram, as well as weapons and equipment that is being prepared, as well as their deception plan. So I think recently you saw something regarding a deception plan.
Yeah, so recently Enrique Tarrio, the chairman, was on a podcast with Tim Pool, and in it saying that basically for the protest that was taking place at Delta Park, he had put out online that it was actually taking place at another park, just to kind of get Antifa members to be located at another area away from them. But yeah, so there is kind of that outlook of misinformation to put in place.
Yeah. In terms of the Proud Boys, again, forming up points is in places like parks. Again, they will have vehicles that will arrive with banners as well as equipment that's being dropped off. So they have logistical teams supporting them as well. Similar in terms of sort of distances to actually get to the target location. But for them, from a target location, one, it's either conducting their own events, which are based on protests regarding things like free speech or anti-Antifa protests, or attending left-wing events in order to antagonize them. And then actions on the target locations, they will actually either conduct speeches, they'll confront adversary groups, as well as attempt to antagonize groups, so they conduct violence. And the types of incidents we've seen regarding Proud Boys are protests, harassment, intimidation, projectiles thrown, as well as ABH and GBH. But we could get to a point where things escalate in the future, and we do see tit-for-tat targeting between each groups. Yeah. And in terms of the actual quantity of Proud Boys who we will see at events, I think the most we've seen is up to about 1,000 people. But again, you mentioned it, Vincent, that there are other groups who seem to just sort of tag along and sort of inflate those numbers. What I also want to explain from an intelligence perspective, so what you had in the shooting in Denver, Colorado, where the security guard actually shot the right-wing protester and killed him, was a really interesting intelligence process that took place on 4chan. So we kind of monitored the 4chan thread and just kind of explained some of the things that we found. What I will say to the people on 4chan is that they're really effective from an intelligence perspective. Within 90 minutes, there was 426 replies and 90 images that were uploaded. And key themes that we found was that they were very efficient in intelligence gathering. They found a variety of social media profiles as well as emails associated with the security guard. And they even found his gamer profile, his Steam profile as well.
And something about his father's information as well.
Yeah,
Right,
yeah. So that was another thing that they also did, was actually leaking the father's Facebook profile as well as his wife's Facebook profile as well. So not only just limiting it to him, they're also revealing information regarding his extended family and probably putting them at risk as well.
Which I think is quite important, that they don't just look at the individual, because I think from a business perspective, and we've mentioned it before, that it's not just looking at businesses that might be pro BLM or anti BLM, whichever side, but their employees as well. So, and you've seen it with multiple incidents of someone getting caught, more so like hate crimes towards Asians or anything like that, but get a recording, and then all of a sudden he gets identified by people on the internet. They find out his workplace, then the workplace gets flooded with emails or tweets saying, is this your employee, can confirm, or this is your employee, we found him, this is what he's doing, share the video. And then all of a sudden the business is on the back foot, having to say, we're opening an internal investigation. And then oftentimes the person gets fired and the business replies with a generic, we're for this, we're for that. And this is not behavior that we condone within the business and stuff. I just try to be on the back foot. But the actions of individuals can often have an impact on businesses. So definitely something to be aware of.
Or the risk of them actually misidentifying the person and releasing the wrong details of somebody else.
And we've seen that in the past, Boston bombing as an example of where they misidentified, and it was actually someone who had been missing and found dead later on. So it's the internet is one of those places that can go kind of both ways, for good or evil.
Yeah, I mean, other themes that we found is things like people had released on 4chan emails relating to the security guard when he was allegedly part of the Occupy Denver movement. They'd found business profiles and business websites, such as using things like the Wayback Machine to actually read old content. There was also conspiracy theories that were being circulated, such as the security guard working with the CIA or talking about Jewish people being behind recent shootings in the US. There was also trolling by infiltrators into the forums, attempting to undermine their findings, as well as one person commenting saying, it feels so good seeing you white scumbags losing your country and seeing your pathetic culture being replaced. So a lot of antagonization going on between the people on the forum, which again, it only antagonizes them and just sort of escalates the sort of the rhetoric and the vitriol between these different groups. We saw racist messages being posted on the forum, conversations about Antifa. They posted the security guard's party affiliation, as well as what was interesting was some people were making this comment about it's 4chan versus Glow. Now, Glow refers to this idea that the intelligence agencies bait potential criminals or gather intelligence about a particular online community to reveal their intentions or belief, and this is known as Glow posting. They were sharing social media profiles, sharing his address, his emails, but also not only the hashed passwords, but also clear text passwords as well. They even shared his email address and its have I been pwned status. Now that means that it's a website where you can actually see that this email has actually been compromised as part of some sort of hack. So providing people with the potential to actually try and hack his email account and try and find more information out regarding him. They also downloaded images from his Facebook page and put it on an Imgur page. So that's then saved there for historical record if they want to go back to it. And in light of all the attention that the incident garnered through the research, we also noticed that family Facebook profiles were either hidden, anonymized, or completely deleted. Comments were made on profiles linked to the security guards, such as mentioning the name of the man who was shot, or stating on like YouTube in the comment section saying, you're going to go to jail. Research was conducted of people and organizations linked to the incident, and people were trying to make connections between him and Antifa. And then finally, although there was lots of circumstantial evidence linking the security guard to wards having left-wing leanings, there was nothing that was confirmed to actually suggest that he was a member of Antifa. However, across social media, he was labeled as being Antifa. So for me, from an intelligence perspective, it just kind of shows you just how much is going on behind the scenes outside of these real world incidents that we're seeing. There's all this intelligence gathering that's going on between the different factions, which I think is interesting for us to just note regarding what we might see through the selection process. The final step is where we actually determine the threat courses of action. So just kind of go through some of the things that we've discussed. polling stations, I think, is going to be key as part of this election, whether or not we see intimidation from a variety of groups, or whether or not you see counter protests by other groups in relation to this, and perhaps escalations at polling stations. The inauguration is going to be absolutely key, and any violence or incidents and protests that we see surrounding that. But also, if there is this period between the election being conducted and the final nomination as to who's actually won the presidential nomination, I think any location that is linked to a decision, whether it's a state Supreme Court or a Supreme Court of the United States, they're going to see actions. They're going to see people who are attending from a protest perspective.
I think especially based on the rhetoric we've seen from kind of both candidates, or both sides at least, regarding that one side might be trying to steal the other, based either on mail-in fraud, based on removing machines from post offices, based on Trump tweeting to his supporters to go to polling stations. So I think all this rhetoric and vitriol that we've seen over the last few months just puts these places at a higher risk of seeing unrest or the potential of armed conflict between certain individuals.
Yeah. And that polarization is absolutely key. And it seems clear that no matter who actually wins the presidency, that is just going to continue through into the next term, because I don't think either candidate can actually bring the country together. So post-election, from a threat course of action perspective, I think it depends on what the narrative is. If it's an overwhelming majority for one of the candidates, then fine. I think, yes, we're going to see continued protests and continued escalations potentially towards violence. However, the worst case scenario is that the rhetoric coming from the candidate who lost is saying that, it was a stolen election, because I think that is just going to really ratchet up tensions. We saw with the Michigan militia where they wanted to actually target the governor. I think we could see the targeting of politicians going forward as well. We've mentioned the prospect for a civil war, which we don't think, will happen for a variety of reasons, but we do believe that there is a civil war in terms of a civil war of information as to where the country should be heading, and why there's such a divergence of opinion regarding that. But if we do see issues like the potential to secede from the state, or movements like that grow, these could be issues around which extremists start to gather, and actually we see actions in relation to them. We've talked about information as well as echo chambers, and just how bad that is getting within, not just the US, but, definitely in the West, and how that is going to just escalate the situation as well going forward. But then also from a business perspective, logistically, supply chain, the ability to actually operate in some of these cities, seeing the an increase in autonomous zones and the impact that is going to have on businesses in the area is going to be significant. But then also the actual targeting of businesses. You have left-wing extremists now talking about targeting Jeff Bezos as well as Amazon. And we can see that from a threat course of action just increasing going forward.
Yeah, and that's not taking in fact COVID-19 and the impact it's already had on businesses. Some who you mentioned earlier went bankrupt, and so the culmination of COVID-19 plus the potential for unrest is for businesses, is for some will go under again because of this.
Yeah,
I think we're seeing the potential for the targeting of political leaders, but also business leaders. So as you mentioned there, the far left like Jeff Bezos, but also we're seeing the far right or libertarian groups looking at business leaders such as Bill Gates and blaming him for the various conspiracy theories that are locked down and causing the economic impact. So I think we'll see an increase of targeting of prominent people of influence by both left and right after the elections.
Yeah. And I think you can see just the amount of information that goes into us having to kind of research just to really understand from an analysis perspective how things are going to actually turn out and the different scenario options that there are. Us at Intelligence Fusion will be monitoring the US election. We'll be recording incidents relating to any group depending on their, not based on their political affiliation. We just look at every incident on an incident by incident basis to provide our clients with the assessment that we feel that they need to understand in order to operate, and from a business perspective, to operate more effectively through uncertain times. If you liked our content today, please like, share, and subscribe. It helps us a lot. And thanks so much for your time.